Canada's economy is changing, and it's bringing really big opportunities for us as Canadian investors. Today, I want to talk about the new legislation that just passed through the House of Commons. I want to talk about what exactly this is going to bring for what kinds of Canadian companies, where the opportunities are with these projects. And of course, we're going to talk about two of the big oil and gas projects that have been sort of floated out there, and the likelihood that we might see one or both of these projects actually happen. Welcome to Larch Investing. My name is Liam. Here we talk about investing in Canada. If you like that at all, please do like the video and subscribe to the channel. Now we're going to start here. You see it on the screen right beside me. You got BNN Bloomberg pulled up. Let's just talk about what exactly this legislation was, because it was not quite controversial in the traditional sense, but it was huge. And in a world where we see constant fighting between the sort of left and right in Canada, this is one of the few times that I've seen both the Liberal and Conservative Party come together to make something happen. And them coming together has basically made everybody else very mad. So let's read through the legislation and see what exactly their sort of the bill was. What exactly is it they're going to do to change the economy? Now, there's a couple of key things. They've called this bill C-5, or the One Canadian Economy Act. And that tells you already what they're sort of going for. We've heard the sort of political commentary lots about building one Canadian economy out of 13. The idea that we're going to bring all the provinces together and do stuff better, more efficiently. And in fairness, this is definitely something that the Americans seem to do better than most of the rest of the world. Taking, all the different states with all of their different legislative bodies and making it one economy so that companies there can grow to scale much easier. It's one of the big reasons why we love investing in American companies around the world, right? Is that they have this huge market just domestically. So they promised to pass it before Canada Day, and it's set up to become law. It allows them to greenlight a list of projects that are national interest projects. We on the channel have talked about a couple of these. We'll talk about a couple of these later in this video. But it also does a little bit of sort of getting out of the way from the perspective of the federal government of provincial trade barriers. And we'll talk about that as well in here. So it was introduced on the 6th. For reference, today I'm filming this the 21st, but it passed on the 20th. So, quite a quick turnaround for a major piece of legislation. On the second of two votes in the House of Commons on Friday, yesterday, Mark Carney, the Prime Minister, crossed the floor to shake hands with opposition House Leader Andrew Scheer and Conservative Deputy Leader Melissa Lantsman, which is crazy, right? Like, again, we're constantly so divided in this country and in the sort of greater Western world that it's awesome to see both the right and the left agree on something. And while the population might be more split than the politicians, hey, I would rather see unity in most cases than seeing them fight each other on everything. They've agreed on a couple of things. The provincial and territorial premiers have given a list of projects they want to see fast-tracked. They're going to have more full conversations now. They're going to sort of spend this summer coming up with these projects. Two premiers that aren't seeing eye to eye include Daniel Smith of Alberta here and BC Premier David Eby next door in British Columbia on the West Coast. They sort of had talked about how most of the premiers are aligned on this sort of energy superpower dialogue, let's say. And Eby is not a fan of crude oil pipelines going to BC, and there's lots of reasons for that, of course. But he has recently approved new LNG pipelines going to BC, which is pretty interesting. They've talked about all sorts of things. I think the major problem that people have mentioned in here that a lot of people have with this bill is, okay, well, now what for Indigenous people specifically and for Indigenous consultation? And the worry really from the business community is we're going to end up in a situation where we have people arguing their rights have been violated, taking things to court, and then we get the same kind of dragged out, nothing gets built process that we've had in Canada for so long. So that is the one challenge. But seeing this bill through Parliament, seeing it, it's going to become a law, there's finally action, I think is the big point on here. And the business community is just about universally on side. They think this is a good idea. I mean, we see 84% of the population voted between the Liberals and the Conservatives. So seeing them agree on something is huge. I want to point out we got TC Energy CEO Francois Poirier that called it a bipartisan step forward for Canada to get back into the business of big nation building projects. He still thinks that there needs to be some reform. I think we all think that there needs to be some reform in building a better Canadian economy, but I think it's really interesting. You immediately see TC Energy, one of the big, they've definitely moved into the LNG space rather than the crude oil space. But one of the big Canadian pipeline companies saying, hey, this is great. But they're not the only ones. And here's where I think we see a broader appeal to this than just, oil and gas pipelines or just new railway or new money for railway or just critical minerals. I'm going to jump over here to an article that was published again on the same bill, the same topic, but it was published a day earlier, updated when the bill passed. And it's from the PwC Canada, an expert from PwC Canada, a big consultancy firm, talking about how this is going to help the economy in general. It's from a guy, Michael Dobner is the guy that this article talks about. He's a national leader of economic and policy practice for PwC Canada, who predicts, ready, there could be a pickup in merger and acquisition activity in 2026. What have we seen in the Canadian oil and gas space over the last year? A huge flood of M&A. We have seen, of course, Strathcona and Meg. We're going to talk about that more on the channel this weekend. We have seen, the recent Keyera purchase. We have seen, big CNRL, Canadian Natural Resources purchases. We have even seen ARC Resources got some stuff, and there's just been so much going on that seeing more mergers and acquisitions would be crazy. Like, how could we possibly bring even more money into the industries? But there's also opportunity beyond just oil, right? All of a sudden, we're talking about maybe expanded opportunities for the mining companies, for other Canadian resource companies. Maybe there's even opportunities in just like construction, right? Maybe there's opportunities there. Really interesting ideas. And when you see a lot of money flowing into the TSX specifically, you're going to see some companies do insanely well. This is speculation here, but I would guess that you're going to see like TSX venture companies, some of these like junior miner style companies explode over the next 2 years, because you're going to see an increased amount of investment activity. There's a bigger total sum of dollars, and you're going to see more of them go into the riskier assets as things start to get better. And it'll be really interesting to see like which ones do and how sort of the community reacts to that, because I think we all fall into the allure of like, oh my God, that stock just went up 10x. I should buy into the next one. And we'll see how long it lasts, right? Because these sort of cycles of, investing in junior miners, etc., definitely come and go, but really interesting. So he talks more about this. He likes the bill. BC5 is suggesting the government's very serious about moving projects much faster. A report from the company from PwC Canada says Canadian companies announced 996 deals totaling 134 billion, but it notes a decline in inbound and locally sourced deals due to persistent uncertainty from U.S. President Donald Trump. Their baseline GDP growth for 2025 is below 1%. So they're not saying necessarily that it's a huge jumping off point this year, but they are saying that it's going to be a big boost in the future. He thinks that the more serious the government is about this, it'll be bigger. And of course, he talks about some key priorities. Here are things that we can think about. Ready? So first, streamline regulations, large scale infrastructure projects. That's our pipelines. Those are our railways. Those are our, electrification projects. We talked about the West Wind one, all sorts of really cool stuff. Talked about increased investment in defense and Arctic development. From an investment perspective, I think the question is like, okay, who's building it? Right? Is there going to be some sort of consortium? Are we going to see like some of the big engineering firms step up, the big building firms in Canada step up and do those projects? And then what increased economic activity do we see brought forwards from those projects? Do we see an increase in mining in the north? There is a wealth of resources up there. I don't know if you guys have sort of looked into some of the stories you'll get out of the Northwest Territories, but there's so much opportunity. And right now, the only opportunities being exploited, let's say, or the only opportunities being actually dug in the resource space are like diamond mines, where there's just a giant amount of cash to be made. And all of the other opportunities are sort of too expensive because you'd have to build the infrastructure to get there and to actually start, processing this material or mining for it or whatever it might be. if you see the federal government step in and sort of take away some of that expense, all of a sudden there's a huge amount more that could be done. And there's companies already talking about big investments into sort of critical minerals specifically, but other mineral activity that'd be sick. Removal of interprovincial trade barriers. That's big for like trucking firms. That's big for construction. If you think about the way construction works in Canada, it's very labor dependent, and there is already frameworks for a lot of tradespeople to work across the country, but it's not perfect. I am somebody who's lived across the country. I'll tell you right now, it's not perfect. And the better it gets, the more efficient companies can be at building large scale projects place to place. And the bigger you can see, like, there aren't really giant Canadian home builders the way you see in the United States, right? With these big publicly traded home building companies. I think the easier it is to work across provinces from a home building perspective, the bigger companies you could see, maybe see big economies of scale. Of course, there is the idea of modular housing that the government's been floating. We'll see what happens with that. I mean, it's not a terrible idea. It's hardly that revolutionary to be building parts of houses sort of in a factory setting where you could sort of automate some of the process. You know, it's 2025. I mean, we automate almost everything at this point. So seeing some of that automation makes some sense as long as it's done well. And anytime you see a sort of a crown corporation doing it, as long as it does well is maybe up in the air. Fast track integration of artificial intelligence and changed immigration system to focus on attracting highly skilled individuals. That's big for tech, right? You're thinking Constellation Software, Shopify, that could be really big for them depending on what you actually see done there. There's just so much. There's so many companies that are impacted by this, and it's basically all positive as long as you don't see the kind of legal pushback that you saw back in the sort of mid 2010s, which is probably the last time we had big projects being built, big infrastructure projects. And if you do see big legal pushback, what happens next? And it could be, again, we talked about the threat towards maybe pipeline projects are worried about Indigenous legal pushback, but also you could see, you know, let's talk about the labor and mobility. Maybe I'm a teacher. What if the teachers union in one province doesn't want to recognize teachers from another province or doesn't like that? Right. All of a sudden there's those kind of questions. And if that's brought up and you get legal challenges everywhere, of course, that does bog down the growth. And that could be a big challenge for not only the federal government, but also, of course, for the companies trying to embrace that growth. If you see these big, building companies that are trying to do these big projects and all of a sudden they're running into these huge legal pushbacks or protests or whatever it might be. Now they're blowing through money because they've sent all these people up to work in the far north. And anybody who's lived up there can tell you it's incredibly expensive. Imagine now you're trying to build to an area that doesn't have any infrastructure already, just that the level of expense it would be to have a crew there, to have machinery there, to have, living quarters somewhere there, right? Like there's so much that could go wrong if you do see public backlash. And if you don't, which again, just because it's been sort of brought up by the media doesn't mean it'll happen. But if you don't see public backlash, fantastic. So many companies are going to absolutely kill it. Now, here on the channel, we really do focus a lot on energy investing. It's one of the big opportunities in Canada right now. In the public markets, energy is cheaper than it would be to actually try to start your own company, which is crazy, right? You can buy from the comfort of your home. You can buy into energy companies and yield more than it would cost for you to start your own company, do all the work yourself. And so big energy projects are really important when we see the kinds of challenges Canadian energy faces. We've talked about it a million times on the channel. There's probably 5 or 6 different videos you could find that I have made talking about the different challenges facing Canadian energy, specifically Canadian oil and gas. But one of the biggest ones is geography. Now, this last month, we've seen Canadian geography be a massive benefit. We are insulated from most of the major conflicts of the world. Now, again, if the United States decides to invade us, totally different story. But right now, we're not involved in any of the sort of conflict in the Middle East, any of the conflict in Europe, any of the conflict in Africa, right? A lot of other energy basins are. Even you talk about the natural gas opportunity in sort of the South Pacific / Indian Ocean area, there's still conflict there. So Canada being so far removed from everything means that we are reliable, we're safe. We can supply our allies and our friends and they can depend on supply from here. But costs so much to get this oil and gas from, northeastern BC, northern Alberta, central Alberta, Saskatchewan, all the way down to the coast, either in British Columbia or, by rail to the coast in New Brunswick, to then ship it off to the rest of the world. Of course, the solution we've come up with for the last 50, 60 years is basically to ship it to the US and let the United States do the shipping. Let them find the markets, let them, take that extra profit. But of course, that means that we receive a lot less for our oil. It's been hugely discounted. Now, the biggest thing that happened in the last 5-10 years for Canadian oil and gas is the Trans Mountain Expansion Pipeline. Of course, another infrastructure project, another controversial, fight. But the more projects we see, the better it gets. And so I want to click over to something that has given me some hope for the idea of West Coast projects. Right here, this is straight from the CBC. So hardly a source that people in the oil and gas industry would argue loves them. Straight from the CBC, we have an article talking about the BC Premier and the new LNG pipeline they've approved to terminus near Prince Rupert. And look at who is involved in this project. This is a framework, a style of project that I think is going to do really well, right? You see immediately you're getting a local First Nation partnered with a major company. So in this case, it's the Nisaga Nation. I'm probably saying that wrong. I'm not from BC and I don't know the people locally, and Texas-based Western LNG. And of course, there has been some pushback against this, right? We've seen this. This is the story in BC right now, that the population is going to push back, so the government won't allow this to happen. But the NDP Premier is supporting this project. Let's see what he says, okay? BC Premier David Eby is defending the provincial government's approval to continue construction on a new pipeline project that will supply natural gas to proposed floating liquefied natural gas LNG terminal north of Prince Rupert. The Prince Rupert Gas Transmission Project is a joint venture between the Nisaga Nation and Texas-based Western LNG to supply natural gas to the Ksai-Lisims LNG project, which is an Indigenous-owned project that has some partners. We've talked about it as well. They're a treaty nation that has control over their jurisdiction. So having the nation involved is giant. And look where this is coming from. Again, this is the area we talked about. That this is the Montney, the Duvernay is all along here. And the pipelines that they're building, connecting up to places like Prince Rupert on the coast, these are huge projects. And so seeing Indigenous ownership is clearly not only a way to allow public support, but also it gives sort of more left-leaning political leadership an out. We've seen this from both the Liberal federal government, but also now we're seeing it from the BC government, where as long as there is a nation, a First Nation, treaty nation, who is an equity partner in this project, supporting this project, well, who is that politician to deny that, to oppose that? And I think that's a really interesting point. Seeing ownership from First Nations is a huge way to stop what I warned about earlier in the video, that public backlash. Think about the difference between a protest against Enbridge, right? Think about Northern Gateway, right? Big name brand Canadian oil and gas stock. You're thinking Alberta, you're thinking suits and ties down in Calgary, right? From the perspective of a lot of people that would protest against that, really easy to make Enbridge the enemy. Now let's put a treaty nation as the headline owner of the project. And I'm not saying they own 100%. Nobody ever owns 100% of something that costs this much. But let's say they're one of the headline owners because of maybe the new federal grant program that helps these nations buy into and have an equity stake in these big infrastructure projects. Well, what does that protest look like now? And how does that protest look different from the perspective of political leadership? Well, now if you're protesting against a First Nation that is supporting a project going through their territory, like whose side are you on? And from a political perspective, it makes a lot of sense. And from a business perspective, it's a really smart idea. The costs that will come from not having these projects built, from having huge protests or legal pushback, is far greater than the cost of having an Indigenous equity partner. And there are lots of Indigenous groups out there that would love to be partners in these projects. Of course, I don't speak for Indigenous people, but I think one of the biggest misconceptions we get as a nation is that Indigenous people are one group. Remember, there are literally thousands of Indigenous people and Indigenous groups, Indigenous nations, whatever way you want to split them up. There are thousands of different groupings and millions of people, each with their own unique perspectives. So there are Indigenous people completely aligned with a lot of the big nation building ideas here in Canada that want to support the energy sector. I saw an article the other day that talked about the fact that there is a higher representation of Indigenous people in the energy industry than across the rest of the economy. You're seeing up to 7% of energy industry employees from the basic construction level tasks all the way up are Indigenous people. And that is awesome. And we should support that regardless of your perspectives politically on Indigenous people, on truth and reconciliation. Honestly, it shouldn't matter, because from a business perspective and investing perspective, having these people as part of the project is amazing, is awesome. And we should look to that. If it's working in British Columbia, it will work just about anywhere else. And I think it is a great sign that we're seeing that happen with LNG, which seems to be the easier, sort of more politically approachable task, getting LNG to the West Coast. And so you might be thinking to yourself right now, okay, well, this guy is a big proponent of the oil and gas industry. Big part of that is oil. We're shipping it down to the US at a discount. Yes, we got TMX, right? Obviously, there's some capacity there, right? They're ramping production to hit capacity over the next couple of years. Then what? Then we're in the same position we were a couple of years ago with this huge discount. And of course, we can have the whole argument about the decline of US shale, but today's video is really focused on Canada. So let's talk about the other project that I think could be huge in supporting the oil side of the ticket here. And of course, back to the CBC. This time we're going to the other side of the prairies, Manitoba, where the premier there, the Indigenous premier, Wab Kinew, has floated oil shipments through Hudson's Bay as part of the potential trade corridor. And I strongly recommend, if you're a Canadian investor, you're investing into these big Canadian energy companies, you want to see the direction of the Canadian economy, the Canadian resource industry, listen to Wab Kinew talk about his ideas for the Port of Churchill. Because I think he's one of those people that can pull another NDP premier, might I mention, that can pull together the right and the left in the same way that we've seen them come together federally. And if he can do that from the perspective of the provinces, right, he can pull together the support that's needed to get big projects done. Again, this could be a huge opportunity. He has said specifically that oil could be among the commodities shipped through the Hudson's Bay if Canada proceeds with a new or expanded port along the province's coastline. He asked Mark Carney to support a northern trade corridor that would improve a new all-season road. So again, there's that infrastructure, the building, the stuff that sort of costs so much. A hydroelectric transmission line to Nunavut, allowing for more, resource, more, lower cost of living, a million things that both help the population and help industry, and potentially a pipeline to the Hudson's Bay, which of course where we're going with this. He says the oil is among the commodities that could be shipped through Arctic waters via Hudson's Bay. Premiers in past floated the idea of liquefied natural gas or hydrogen shipments as well. Talking about a pipe, what is a product that makes sense? He said during a scrum with reporters following a speech in the RBC Convention Center in Winnipeg. We're looking at liquefaction, maybe then it's an LNG thing, or we're looking at oil and gas, or we're looking at something novel like green hydrogen or maybe potash. He said he was open to the construction of a second port on Hudson's Bay because of the ecological sensitivities at the Port of Churchill. At the Churchill River estuary, where large summer congregations of beluga whales attract tourists. Polar bears also gather each of Churchill each fall before the bay freezes up, which is again a huge tourist industry. He said he would entertain proposals from private industry about the best location to place a new port, pipeline terminal, or transshipment center along Hudson's Bay, taking into account logistics, environmental concerns, and Indigenous interests. And there are lots of ports that have happened. One of the things I teach is Canadian history. Port of Hudson's Bay, or the Hudson's Bay in general, has had many ports along it. Right, you're talking about the Nelson River, of course. We're talking about the Churchill River, but there's lots of other places you could place a port. And of course, there's a million different things that people far more qualified than me would have to look at to say, okay, this is the spot for it. And here, you can see it on the screen, it's right beside me. Here's part of what makes me so confident here. Danielle Smith's on side. Danielle Smith praises the idea. She loves the idea of a northern oil pipeline in Manitoba. She's talking about how it's a good Team Canada approach and how it will benefit the Canadian economy. And again, this is a right-wing leader of a conservative party supporting a left-wing leader's idea of a big nation-building project. Again, we're seeing the same coming together on these topics, and it's big. So let's wrap with a couple of key thoughts here and a couple of things that I'm looking for this summer. With Parliament now just about done, we're not going to see any big headlines coming out of Parliament specifically. No new laws, no new, big deals. We're not going to see a big pushback in the House of Commons or any of that stuff. Instead, we're probably going to see more speeches. We're going to see a lot of the stuff we saw before Parliament sat back down. So we're going to see, probably the Prime Minister talking about big projects. He's going to go talk with Indigenous groups. That's his big, hurdle to conquer. There is how does he make sure those people are being brought in and being, made partners in this deal in a way that supports them, supports their communities, but also builds the nation. So that's a big role from the federal government. We're going to see provincial governments supporting their own individual interests. Again, we talked about Nova Scotia with the offshore wind, seeing Manitoba with the Hudson's Bay, seeing British Columbia with the LNG, of course, Alberta here, we're trying to build oil pipelines. Everybody's got their thing. Ontario's got their stuff that they're doing. And of course, they've gone a slightly different route about it. So we're going to leave them sort of in the corner here, but everybody's got their thing. So everybody's going to be talking about their individual project. And the most important thing for us as investors, when do we see a company come out and say, hey, here's our idea. We're a proponent now. We're finally stepping up to the plate. We will build this thing. And then what happens? And that will be the biggest test of whether or not this is really the turning point that changes the Canadian economy forever. Because if those companies step up to the plate, make a big proposal, it's a good proposal, it fits all the things it needs to, they actually sort of followed the brief and met all the criteria, and it is like literally perfect nation building project, tying together provinces, building the Canadian economy, what happens? Because if that project gets approved, we're off to the races. And you're going to see a massive flow of investment into Canada because there are millions of people and thousands of companies in this country that are going to benefit from these projects. And I'm very excited to see who gets first to the plate. And those are about my thoughts. Let me know what you think. Do you think we're going to see stuff get done? Seeing this pass, seeing the left and the right come together on this, does that change your opinion on where Canadian sort of infrastructure projects, resource industries are going? Or do you think that this is all kind of a red herring and you're staying away from it? Let me know in the comments down below. And of course, if you think there's a specific project or company that's going to benefit the most, I would love to hear about that in the comments. Let me know your thoughts. We're going to be talking about a couple of specific companies in the not so distant future. We're going to be analyzing a couple of really interesting opportunities. And as always, we talk about investing in Canada every single week here on the channel. So if you like this kind of stuff, please do subscribe. And with that being said, I hope I see you in the next video.